Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's very special event in which we're delighted to be hearing from the Right Reverend Paul Butler, the Bishop of Durham, reflecting on his ministry here in the Northeast over the last 10 years. It is indeed wonderful to be here in St. Peter's Chapel in Auckland Castle, which has itself seen so much transformation over the last 10 years, of which more later. My name is Plyming, and I serve as Dean of Durham, overseeing the life and mission of Durham Cathedral, of course, the seat of the Bishop of Durham. I've only been in this role since September, but I have ministered in this diocese since 2017, when I came to be Warden of Cranmer Hall within St. John's College, Durham University. And therefore, Bishop Paul has been my bishop all that time, and I consider myself blessed to have served with him. So it's a delight for me to lead our time together this evening. Let me explain to you how it's going to work. I've got some questions which I've talked through with Bishop Paul, and I'm going to sort of walk us through those for about 45 minutes. Then we'll take a little bit of a break just so that we can digest what we've heard and begin to formulate questions that we want to ask for ourselves. And that will take us through till 7:30, at which point some welcome refreshments wait for us all, really. So that's where we're going to go. I hope we're in for a great time. I'm sure we are. Bishop Paul, or Paul, as I think you prefer to be called.
Absolutely.
So I'll call you that without any sign of lack of respect. But Paul, thank you for taking my questions and then the questions from us all this evening. We're delighted to hear about your experiences from your 10 years as Bishop of Durham. Can I take you back, first of all, further than 10 years, to before you came to Durham? What did you know about the county and the diocese before you came? And I guess in those first few months of the role, what surprised you? What do you remember as those key memories?
So the honest answer is to what did I know is not very much. I had been to Durham a few times. After university, before training, I spent 2 years working with something called the University and College Christian Fellowship on their bookstall service. And on 2 occasions, I visited Durham University to visit the University Christian Union. And on 1 occasion, I visited what was then Sunderland Polytechnic, likewise to do some work with their very small Christian Union. So that was 3 visits. And I had also come on a training week for bishops when I was Bishop of Southampton. And we stayed actually in St. John's, and that was my first experience actually of walking the pilgrim's route onto Lindisfarne. Mm-hmm. So that was my knowledge. Rosemary had to admit that she had been to a wedding in Sunderland of a friend, and that on the day of the announcement, which happened in the September before we started, she quietly admitted that she had never been inside Durham Cathedral ever before. So we didn't know a great deal. In fact, I can tell you when I was invited to, when I was first approached about my name going on what's called the long list, one of the objections that I had put forward as to why I shouldn't be on it was that I didn't know anything about the Northeast. Really, and I wasn't really a typical Bishop of Durham type of person, to which I was told by the Archbishop's appointments advisor that they were not valid objections,
and hence where you are.
So that was it. So what struck us? So I have to be honest. Growing up in Chessington in Surrey, going to school in Kingston on Thames. I had got some created images of County Durham, but that's what County Durham was like, of course, in the 1960s and so on. So I still had pits and smoke and coal dust and shipbuilding and steelworks. So I had an image of, bluntly, dirt, actually, and industry. I also had the image of the Bishop of Durham being appointed in 1984, when I was a curate, one David Jenkins, and I'm afraid the honest truth is that the curate of 1984 didn't think very much of said David Jenkins and his theology. So I had that image, although I also had images from actually knowing a little bit of Michael Turnbull and knowing Tom Wright quite well. So in the first months, the big skies, the green hills, the golden sands. Although you don't have to stay at sea and beach for very long before you start seeing coal dust coming in and so on. And the lack of industry. The levels of poverty that were visibly obvious. The extraordinary warmth of the people. But the different nature of what hospitality looks like. People don't invite you into their homes. Now that's because culturally, you talk to people on the street. You sat outside your back door and you chatted to your neighbours along the street and across, and the streets were places you played, but you didn't invite people inside your home. So it's a different style of hospitality. It's not being inhospitable. It's a very different style of hospitality, and it took me ages to get my head around that. So those some of the early impressions.
In those 10 years, you've travelled to basically every corner of this county and diocese.
Yes.
Every parish, every community. Just give us a sense, what are some of the special places that have most special memories for you? Just give us a flavour. I know you.
I'm not
asking you what's your favourite place. I'm telling us what some of the special places. What are some of the special memories from across this diocese?
So some of them are deeply historically linked. So the Jarrow, Monk Wearmouth, monasteries, Bede, and all that goes with them. It is extraordinary standing in St. Peter's Monk Wearmouth, leading worship and seeing the tiny little Saxon doorway, which is still there, and thinking of Bede walking in and out. And likewise at Jarrow, what's now the chancel area of St. Paul's Jarrow, which is still the Saxon thing, and thinking about. So those are they're incredible. Because I have to say the cathedral is an extraordinary place, but we might come back to the cathedral in a different way. Walking in Teesdale and Weardale. I actually said that, so probably about 2 years in, I can remember saying to someone in Teesdale, I think this is even better than any of the Yorkshire Dales. And they said, Bishop Paul, we agree, but please don't tell anybody. We're trying to keep it secret.
Yeah, that's right. No.
Because they are absolutely glorious. But I love sea and beach. And I love Tommy at Seaham.
Yeah.
So those are some of the places, but it's always been the people. Everywhere you go, it's the people you meet and the people you talk with, and so on. So and the variety. I mean, I love the variety. Having 7 local authorities to work with. So I've got Hartlepool, Stockton, Darlington, County Durham, Sunderland, South Tyneside, Gateshead. There is such variety in all of those, and the communities and the people and so on. So
Now you've lived here in Bishop Auckland, and I know you've taken on some specific roles here in Bishop Auckland, including chairing the Brighter Bishop Board.
Yeah, we had our last meeting this afternoon.
What was getting involved at that level in the community? Why was that important for you? And how's it been part of your ministry as a bishop, kind of being very kind of locally focused?
So there's been 2 aspects to it, although they're intertwined. One is having the office here, and Edward made points about the importance of that. And talking to Jonathan Ruffer very early on about the office being here and having signs up about the Bishop of Durham, pointing out to visitors to this place that the Bishop of Durham is not a figure of history, but it's a living, serving role. Doesn't make a lot. So there's been all the stuff about being here, and inevitably getting involved in conversations about the castle, about the Faith Museum, about Kinran. I still have very, very vivid memories of Jonathan coming and sitting down and telling me the vision for Kinran, and I did actually say to him, "You're bonkers." But if anybody can make it work, Jonathan, you can.
And it's wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is extraordinary. So there's been that. But I was reminded today, it genuinely was the last meeting of the Right Bishop Board today. Chris Myers, who's the Durham County Council officer, who's worked on us all the way through, he reminded me that he came with Sarah Robson, who was then the lead, and sat in my office in 2016 and said, we want to do stuff about restoring finding a new life for the High Street, and we need an independent person to head it up. And we wondered if you would do it both as the bishop, but also as a resident.
Yeah.
And they said it's a 2-year project. This was 2016, and we had the last
sort of 2 years.
today.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's because of the way the things are unfolded.
Yeah.
But it's given me a rootedness in engagement in the community in which I live. Yeah. And it has meant, I'm going to pick that, it has meant that I've been able to work with this extraordinary man down here. Bob McManus is well, most of you know him, he is a legend, really. He has fought for this town in so many ways. And I've worked with Rob York and David Land, and there's a number of others of you here. And it has been such a privilege to work with local business people, with local charity, with local volunteers, with the civic society, with TAP, and with the county council and with the town council on what hope now. And the slight sadness about one of the slight sadness about leaving now is when we're not quite at seeing all of that come to fruition. But I can walk down Newgate Street and Stack is going up, and the Kingsway car park is coming in, and that dreadful Golden Casino has gone, and there's going to be a new walkway through. And and some of the upstairs properties are now back in use, and there's more of that happening. And TAP has delivered what it promised. And one of the things early on was the skepticism and the, frankly, vitriol at times against Jonathan and what he came, and the conviction that they would, he and Jane would just walk away. And I always knew that was untrue, but it's been, it has been wonderful to be kind of actively engaged in this community.
And we'll come back later to how that's impacted on your national role, Paul. Can I just ask a little bit more about the Auckland Project, TAP as it's known? They've been part of organising this evening's event. Yeah. What excited you? Go back to those first times. What excited you about the vision for TAP in the first place? And what's encouraged you most? As you say, it's not hasn't reached the end of its story. No. But what you've seen already come to fruition.
So Jonathan was always very clear. This is a 25 to 30 year project minimum that started in 2012. So we're, at the very least, we're not quite halfway there. Mm-hmm. So there's a long way. There is a long way to go. But what drove Jonathan and Jane from day one, when Jonathan went away on that retreat, where he felt God say to him, "It's time to start using your money, giving it away," but not just giving it away, but actually it's all been about social regeneration. It's about creating jobs. It's been about creating hope for people, for changing a community, and that you can't do overnight. That takes a long time. We were at the meeting today. David Land was pointing out that the new development at Tyndale, that's 450 new jobs for this community. And TAP has been creating jobs. And I was down at Kinran doing some filming for a Christmas piece. And there's a whole bunch of people down there who have jobs that didn't exist beforehand. There's people working in this place, and these jobs didn't exist. And as the Kinran Park develops and so on, and becomes a 364-day thing, there's going to be more and more jobs. And the great thing is Kinran volunteers have learned all the skills. That means that there'll be prime people to take up a lot of those jobs. So it's about local jobs. So yeah, it's that conviction that actually you can offer social regeneration, you can offer hope.
You talked about the economic regeneration. One of the things that's also been at the heart of your ministry as a bishop has been your passion for children and young people. You'd worked with Scripture Union before you became a bishop. That's been all the way through your ministry. And in fact, just a few months ago, I was with you when you were sharing your own Christian story to 100 young people in Durham Cathedral as part of the Pulse sort of story, which was fantastic. What's been so energizing about working with children and young people as a bishop, and what's brought you, why are you passionate about it, and what's brought you great joy in doing that?
So it does go back to my own Christian. I was raised not in a church-going home, and coming to a living faith in Jesus Christ as a teenager through the witness of my peers at school through the Christian Union, and a really active, very good youth work in a free church that I started going to because I fancied my sister's best friend. But, and them introducing me to Jesus as someone who I can know and love and serve and follow, and making a commitment to that just before I was 15 years old. So part of the passion is somebody told me about Jesus when I was a teenager in a way that has impacted my entire life. So I want to do the same for another generation. A story I don't tell very often, but that in that youth group, there was a really big tragedy in that two of our friends. On a Sunday night, we used to pack into somebody's home, and then we'd all make our way home. And at that point, I used to cycle, but some of our mates were old enough to have little motorbikes, and Jim Campion, who'd been a friend for a while, got on his Honda 50, and my sister Mary and her best friend Joyce, the one that I fancied that I never did go out with. Had an argument about who was going on the back of the bike. We're talking early 1970s. And in the end, Joyce jumped on the back of that bike. And they rode. Mary got into a friend's car to get a lift home. And I went off on my push bike. And 3 minutes later, I went round the bend, and I found Joyce and Jim dead in the road. They had gone straight smack back into a skip. This was early 1970s, helmets, unlit skips, all sorts. And I know that it's meant I've lived with an awareness of the shortness of life. And that just because you're young doesn't necessarily mean you have a whole lot. So I want children and young people to hear the good news of Jesus while they have opportunity. There's a whole load more to it. I just love working with children and young people. I love the energy they give. I love the questions they ask. I love the insights they bring. They don't always realize, often the questions or the comments they make, they don't realize the depths that they've gone to theologically or philosophically, but they make me think and they make me see things differently. So,
and I've seen the impact they have on you when you're speaking to children, when you're speaking to young people, you come alive, or they see a different part of your character. Do you recognise that?
Oh, yeah. And one of the things that I've not been able to do very much as bishop is I love storytelling, and I love telling stories I love telling the Bible stories to John and using imagination and so on. Yeah, no, they do. They bring me alive.
Now, one of the roles you had earlier on in your time as Bishop of Durham was relating to children, but in a much sadder way, which is you were lead bishop for safeguarding within the Church of England.
I was for 6 years,
and I remember you giving a number of public apologies to survivors and those affected by church-based abuse, of which the Church of England is rightly ashamed, including after the conviction of Bishop Peter Ball, which was a particularly high-profile case. Why was doing that well important to you, and what do you carry with you from that experience of those 6 years doing that role?
I carry a lot of pain because during those 6 years I listened to a lot of survivors and their stories, which do bring shame on the Church of England and the church more widely, because actually sometimes I was listening to survivors who've been abused in Roman Catholic Church or other churches. And it wasn't just that it happened in the church context, it was also the fact that the church failed to believe them, failed to respond well. And we don't always get it right even now. You know, that we're a lot better than we were, but we still don't always. So I carry a lot of partly because of the trust that sometimes they've placed in me to tell that they've told me their story, and they don't want me to tell it to other people. When I started, the Church of England had shared a national lead safeguarding person with the Methodist Church. And I still remember having to argue the case for increasing from a shared post to a full-time post, and then to a team of 4. And the reality is, internally, that was a hard argument. It was really tough to persuade fellow bishops and lead people within the kind of structures that we needed to expand that. And that at diocesan level, every diocese needed a full-time safeguarding advisor and would need other people. And everyone said, "Oh, it's going to cost us too much." And I won't go into all the details of the argument. I'm glad I won the argument. Now, I don't know what the number is, but the National Safeguarding Team must be at least 20 people. There isn't a diocese that doesn't have a team of safeguarding people because of the growth of it. Some of that is the nation recognizing, because at the end of the day, the nation has had to face up to the fact that child abuse was almost endemic in institutions, all institutions, back in the 40s and 50s and 60s. So we've had to face up to that, and we've had ICSA doing that national inquiry and so on. And I that's another. I'm not sure I've ever had the chance to say this publicly. I can remember with the Archbishop of Canterbury sitting with a Home Secretary who will remain nameless, saying, "This is a problem that the nation needs to face up to. We need a national inquiry," and the government telling us that was never going to happen.
Really?
But it did.
It did, yeah.
And it's exposed also, and it's still, we're still living with it. So on. So I got lots of it wrong. I misunderstood things. Because we were all learning. But it's still painful. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about one of the first impressions you'd have living in the Northeast was visible poverty, and that's something that you've spoken about not only locally but also in your national role as a member of the House of Lords. How have you come to understand kind of poverty in the way that it is expressed in a Northeast context? And kind of what's motivated you to speak so passionately about it? And I guess as you've seen it develop and the situation changed. What gives you, what are the areas of hope, and also what are the areas of ongoing concern for you?
So I had a privileged background. I grew up in I jokingly used to say to my parents, we were a boring middle class family. Mm-hmm. So I didn't see poverty. And I really I first experienced child poverty in this country firsthand when I was at university and involved in Nottingham University's charity stuff, which meant I went, and they had a social action thing, and I went out and I found myself visiting homes where I thought, goodness, people really, actually people live like this. They live in this dreadful house, and children are growing up in this. So that's how that's how I first. But then I was also I've had the privilege of doing quite a lot of traveling to East Africa, and I did some to Russia and so on. And there I saw real poverty, and I never thought that I would see children in this country in as much need, and sadly I have here in the Northeast. I mean, it's astonishing what some children grow up in still, in the fifth, sixth richest nation on earth. But for me, actually, understanding poverty must be not just about the economics and the finances, because just giving people more. Now, I do actually believe that people having more money in their pockets, better pay, and so on, does make a real difference. So I think the financial poverty matters, the economics matter. But if we see poverty only in those terms, we really miss the depths of poverty. So we have to look at relational poverty, social possibilities, the poverty of opportunity, the poverty of aspiration. And I also have to say we've got to recognize spiritual poverty. And if we don't deal with the lack of dealing with people as human beings who are spiritual beings as part of how we tackle poverty, we're never gonna resolve it. So you have to look at poverty at all levels. Now, inevitably, I suppose, because of the House of Lords and because of I probably sometimes come across as only talking about the economics and the finance and the social and some of the social poverty. But actually, my conviction is you have to deal with poverty at all levels. Otherwise, you never really resolve it. We have a major problem in this country. Joseph Rowntree Foundation published their latest report yesterday. And we have an endemic 20% of the population who we never managed to get out of the deeper poverty. And that's been true for the last 50, 60 years. So you can't blame any political party on it. There's something structural that we've never quite broken. I'm hopeful that a current poverty commission headed up by Baroness Philippa Stroud, which is cross-party and so on, but it's not just cross-party. For the very first time, it's a commission looking at poverty which is bringing together national government, local government, business that's both nationally, big business, but also small and medium-sized business thinking, and the charity sector and the face, and they're saying, this is a problem that we actually have to solve as a nation, as a society, and it's not just a government problem. Business has to be involved. It's not just a business problem. The charity sector has to be, the society has to be, civic society has to be involved. And I'm hoping they might actually come up with some creative, collaborative ideas that no one's ever tried before.
You mentioned the national role and your role in the House of Lords, and you've spoken on poverty. You've also spoken on welfare issues, particularly for immigrants and people seeking asylum.
Yeah.
How have you answered the charge that I know comes up not rarely, that bishops shouldn't be engaged with political matters and that should be left to the politicians.
So my short answer is watch Richard Moss' Politics North Sunday morning, because he asked me that at an interview this morning for that. I absolutely agree that it's not the right place of bishops to be involved in party politics. But politics with a small p is about the polis, it's about the people, it's about civic life, it's about how we are as a society and a community. And the Christian gospel, the Christian good news, has always been about people experiencing life in all. Jesus said, I came that they might have life in all its fullness. So we've always been about life in all its fullness. We're always about people reaching their full potential. The Christian gospel has always been about reconciliation with God, but also reconciliation between people. And as soon as you talk about reconciliation between people, you're talking about how social structure works, how forgiveness works, how we encourage and help one another. That's politics. So how can I not be involved in politics as a follower of Jesus Christ? And that's been the church's history down through the centuries. Now, it happens that because of the extraordinary history of this nation, bishops are more intimately engaged with the life, and we have a place in the house of the Lord. So while we're in there, we have to play our role fully. And absolutely, we're not there to be involved in party politics. It happens that for 10 years, I've been in the House of Lords, and there's only been a Conservative government. So perhaps my one regret is that if I stayed for another couple of years, I suspect there might be a Labour government before the end of that 2 years. And lo and behold, do you know what they'll discover is that the bishops will also ask hard questions, critique them, and say, how might we do it? And their voting figures will be rather, that's just, that's the way of it.
You mentioned earlier that your role has taken you not only kind of from a local to the national, but also international. You mentioned you travelled to East Africa and Russia as well, really. The diocese has a link with Lesotho.
Yep.
I know you visited there, also Burundi and Rwanda. What have you taken away from those visits? How have they added to your ministry as Bishop of Durham? And what's been something that you'll carry with you from those experiences?
So the involvement in East Africa goes right back to training at theological college, getting to know a Ugandan pastor, becoming involved in that region. I first went to Rwanda in 1997, 3 years after the genocide. I've been 20 times since. Rosemary and I've been to Burundi 8, 9, 10 times now. And we have dear friends in Rwanda and Burundi. So that relationship is very personal, it's very engaged, and it's very, very long term. Lesotho's been much more, this is the link that the diocese has, and so on. And so I went, and we've had visits back, and others have been to visit, and it's great. When I was vicar in Walthamstow, there was a point where I was going virtually every year, and I said to the Bishop of Byumba, Onesphore Gwaje at the time, he later became Archbishop, and we stayed with them last summer. They're dear friends. I said to him, I'm thinking of not coming next year because I've done the sums. You can pay 2 pastors for an entire year on what it costs me to fly out here. So we're going to donate you the money.
Yeah.
And he said, don't you dare. And I got back. I'm not sure it was the same trip, because these things kind of collide in your memory, don't they? But I also, I said to my team that I worked with in Walthamstow, I had a couple of team vicars and a church army captain and a youth worker, and I said to them, I'm thinking of not going to Rwanda next year because I feel that it's not fair that I go off for 10 days, couple of weeks, and I leave you to it, and so on. And to a person, they just shouted at me and said, you must keep going. I thought, that was not the reaction I was expecting. So you put the 2 and 2 together. What Onesphore said, the reason he said was, don't you dare, was, he said, you haven't got it, have you, Paul? He said, Relationship matters more than your money. Being here with us, standing alongside us, and then representing us back in the UK means far more to us than you giving us some money. And what my colleague said to me was, going to Rwanda, Uganda, at that time it was those two countries, we see it reviving you. We know it's hard work for you and so on, but you come back with different ideas. You come back with a different perspective. And actually the engagement with the World Church for me, alongside wanting to stand alongside my sisters and brothers in other places, they have opened my eyes to seeing, to learning about God in fresh ways, to discovering more of the depths of what the Christian faith is all about. But they've helped me see this country differently. They've helped me see my engagement and my mission here differently. And they've Can I
ask in what way?
Well, if you take the poverty thing, we have. Let me tell us a story. This is in southwest Uganda with our friend Enoch, and he set up a Ugandan-based charity that particularly worked with. They said, as followers of Jesus, we are meant to stand with the poorest and the most needy. So when you're in one of the poorest nations on earth, how do you decide how you stand with the poorest and the most needy? So you find the poorest and the most needy in your own setting. And they'd identified the Batwa, pygmies. You don't call them, if you ever call them pygmies now, I'm afraid you'll get accused of all sorts of things. But the Batwa. And so he said, so they started working with the Batwa communities. The Batwa were being forced out of the jungle and because of deforestation, all sorts of things like that. And we walked for about an hour across the hilltops, and we were sung the entire way. And when we got to this tiny little village that they were helping the Batwa build on the edge of the forest, so they could still go into the forest to hunt, but they were being given a permanent home, and they were being introduced to better hygiene, which when I reflect on it now, was slightly demeaning, because actually, of course, they knew a lot about hygiene inside the jungle, but it didn't look like anything like our hygiene. But anyway, I had to bless the first ever latrine.
Yep.
Which, of course, was a long drop. I quietly said to Enoch, "You're not expecting me to bless it actually, are you, by using it?" He said, no. But we got taken into one of these tiny little huts, and there was a Batwa woman dying. And obviously we had to have an interpreter, but she thanked us for coming. And there was something about the way she said it and the way that she was there. I thought, this is extraordinary. She all she wants to do is give to us as visitors.
Thank you.
And that kind of just makes you think differently.
I know that the ministry of a bishop is not easy, has not been easy all the time. The support of Rosemary.
I never wanted to do it.
Support of Rosemary has been crucial for that. But what is it about that good news of Jesus that you first encountered as a 15-year-old lad? What is it about the good news of Jesus that has kept yourself going and that you've come back to again and again as the motivation for your ministry? What is it that's fired you still?
Oh, the cross and the resurrection. That's how I've always loved history, and part of the decision to actually become a Christian was reading the Gospels and reading the stories of Jesus' death and the resurrection stories, and trying to make sense of them, because it didn't make any. This doesn't make sense. People don't rise from the dead. Once you're dead, you're dead. You're buried. And and reading them just from a historical base, I thought, actually, although it doesn't seem to make any sense, the only thing that ultimately makes sense of these stories is that they're true. If they're true, then Jesus rose from the dead. If Jesus rose from the dead, then why did he die? And if he rose from the dead, then everything that he said, I have to take incredibly seriously. Well, he said he died so that forgiveness could come about, so that we could be put right with God again. So I come back again and again and again to the cross. And when I look at also going back to your previous question, the biggest question that I get asked in this country is about the question of suffering, and particularly of innocent suffering. And it's a very valid, and it is still for me the biggest argument that people can give in our society that leads to doubt about God. But actually at the cross, I see a God who entered the world and a God who suffered unbelievably innocently. And I'm not trying to claim I can make sense of a lot of suffering, but a conviction that there is a God who loves us and entered into that human suffering to bring us ultimate freedom from it makes more sense than any other explanation anybody's ever given me. So I just keep coming back to it. But the really interesting thing is that in the poorest nations on earth that I've been, in one or two places where Christians are persecuted seriously, I was in Iran on one occasion, for example, they don't ask the question about suffering. They don't ask it in the same way. And they're living with it in a way that I've never lived with, and most of us never live with it. They ask different questions. And they ask questions more about justice. Why is the world so unjust? Which is a different Why do you rich nations keep insisting on keeping us poor? Sorry.
Final question from me before we have the chance to open it up to others. What in the last 10 years have you learned about A, yourself, and
Lots.
B, your God?
You
can do it in any order.
Okay, so we've got my farewell service, and I was telling you beforehand, I finished writing the first draft of my farewell sermon. So, spoiler alert now. The core theme that I want to get across in the farewell service, and it comes across, and you've seen the draft, is that God is faithful. And the utter faithfulness of God through thick and thin. And I've learned more and more about that God is utterly faithful. There are times when I feel like, God, you've left me hanging to dry, and you've left me hanging by a finger thread, but actually, you've never let me drop and not catch me. You've let me drop sometimes, but you've always caught me. So the faith that God is faithful and is for all people, regardless of who they are, background, and so on. One of my favourites one of the things that I still kind of miss about not being a parish, when we were in Walthamstow, it was a very mixed community, and we had 34 nationalities in the congregation and so on. One of the things I used to love about people coming up to the rail to receive communion, they would kneel down, was that sometimes I knew enough about some of the people that one of the poorest people was kneeling next to one of the richest people, that one of the people who was suffering with all sorts of problems with their health was kneeling next to someone who was a successful athlete. But here we all were, equals before God, receiving God's love and God's strength together, and in this together. So that unbelievable faithfulness of God. What have I learned most about myself? I know more than ever that I am a frail, sinful human being. Who always lets people down, who always fails. Mm-hmm. And yet, that God chooses to use people like me and you, that's right. And you. Yeah. And that in the depths of God's love, he takes ordinary people and does extraordinary things through them and with them. And that's what I'm going to miss, is because there are extraordinary people across this diocese, there's extraordinary people in this community, in this room, in this chapel tonight, who do extraordinary things, unsung, unseen. And that, I suppose that's the other thing about God, is God's always God's hardly ever, no, please don't misunderstand me theologically here. God's hardly ever at work in the big and successful. God's always in the corner with the suffering person. Mm-hmm. That's where God is. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we won't know the answer. But what I do know is happening in Gaza at the moment is that there are people who are serving and caring and ministering love, unknown, unsung. And that's where God is.
Paul, we really appreciate what you've shared so far. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for all that you've given to us to think about. What we're going to do now, we're going to give a chance to Paul to have a bit of a break and grab a glass of water. Can I suggest we do two things, just perhaps turning to the person next to us? Number one, we might want to say, is there something you've heard from Bishop Paul that's really stood out for you tonight, something that connected with you personally? And then secondly, is there a question that's coming to your mind? And then we'll take some questions in about 5 minutes' time. But just if you want to stand up, turn around, because I think I will do the same. But one thing that's connected with you...
Can I say, you can ask me anything.
There we go.
I really don't care.
You've heard that. So one thing that struck you, one question that's coming to your mind, come back in 5 minutes.
Or 3. You've just dropped your watch. Well, that wasn't too bad time-wise, actually. Yeah. Thank you.
friends joining us online. So just wave a hand and I'll pick a hand out. And lovely question over here. Yep. So you were a bishop before you came to Durham. What's different about being Bishop of Durham? Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. That's a good question. So I was Bishop of Southampton first. That was a suffragan bishop. So there are differences between being a suffragan and being a diocesan, which is about the level of authority and so on that you have. But then I was Bishop of Sutherland Nottingham for 3.5 years. And of course, I never expected to be a bishop. When you become a diocesan bishop, that having been made a bishop, once you become a diocesan, you assume that's it. So that was part of the shock of having only been there 3.5 years and invited to come up here. So there are several things, and I have to try and unlock in my head. Are these differences because I'd already experienced being a diocesan bishop and I inhabit it because it's this, in that sense I've done it, I've learnt this? And what is it about the bishop? So the Bishop of Durham is permanently in the House of Lords. I wasn't in the House of Lords when I was in Sutherland Nottingham. So there is something about the fact that the Bishop of Durham is always in the House of Lords, which impacts how the diocese itself looks to the bishop. It means that the Bishop of Jarrow, because it's permanent, it means the way that the Bishop of Jarrow's role and the way that the Archdeacon's roles are set up, they're set up to take account of the fact that the bishop will be in the House of Lords, which was different from when I was in Sutherland Nottingham. And that also impacts how the bishop is seen. I was a bit taken aback by how quickly the chief execs of the local authorities and the leaders of the councils in those local authorities contacted me to have a conversation, and they were consistent in their theme, which was, as the Bishop of Durham, you can speak up for the county, for our boroughs, for the North East as a region, and we don't have many people who can do so in the House of Lords. So please speak up for the region. And that wasn't the case in Nottingham, partly because I wasn't in the House of Lords, but I think there's something about that. There is, you can't get away being bishop from the history and the prince bishops and so on. And I go around the amazing way that this place has been redone and tells the story. If I'm being a little critical of it sometimes, is it tells the best story. And there are some of my predecessors who I'm not particularly proud of some of their exploits. We recently had a wonderful visit from the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who came and he blessed the faith, and it was fabulous. He came all the way from Jerusalem just to visit Durham, to go to the Cathedral, to come here to do the blessing, because Anthony Beck was the only ever English Patriarch of Jerusalem, and he wanted to recognize that fact. He knows the story, so I didn't feel it was right to remind him that the reason Anthony Beck was Patriarch of Jerusalem was because he led the blooming First Crusade, conquered Jerusalem, and appointed himself as, which doesn't feel terribly holy. And I do like the way that I think Anthony Beck is probably portrayed relatively well at Kinran. His holiness is not, well, no, for those who've seen it, there's a joke about his holiness. So there's that. So you just can't get away from all that history. That's, of course, not just true. I have to say that's true for Philip and the Cathedral and being Dean of the Cathedral. It's something about. So So yeah, so that hopefully that helps at least.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, it's related to that topic. I was going to ask if there are any ancient rules of remnants left over from the Prince Bishops that affect the way that you retire, as you've been in this area as a bishop.
So the question is whether there's any ancient rules pertaining to the Prince Bishop that are going to affect the way that you retire.
Not that I'm aware of that anyone's pointed out.
You wait till Saturday.
However, there is one about the appointment of the new bishop, which involves this man and the chapter, actually. It is Philip knows this better than I do, but it's the oldest unresolved ecclesiastical law case in the land is between the Dean and Chapter of Durham Cathedral and the Archbishop of York about who holds what are called the spiritualities of the diocese during a vacancy. The Dean and Chapter claim that they hold them, and the Archbishop of York claims that he holds them. And they have had a discussion, I believe, about this forthcoming vacancy. So yeah.
The last came to the High Court in 1890 with something called the June Judgment. It's come back to the High Court occasionally, every couple of 100 years. But we decided we're not going to take it to the High Court this time. We've agreed on the same person. But it came, I have to say, for the sake of historical record, the High Court in 1890 found in favour of the Dean and Chapter,
did, yes.
but the Archbishop didn't like the answer, so rejected it.
But the case goes back to 1200 and something?
1250 or something like that. So that does affect. So we had to make a decision at our chapter meeting last week, but the good news is that we all agreed that Bishop Sarah will be the acting Bishop of Durham.
One of the slightly more, but to go back to your question as well, Steph, one of the slightly more humorous moments, I think, during my 10 years was all around when Scotland was deciding whether or not it was going to go independent again. And people were suggesting that perhaps some of the powers of the Prince Bishop should, if they voted to go independent, that some of the powers of the Prince Bishop should be restored, and that perhaps that I should be given the right to have an army to defend the border.
Yeah. And your own coinage.
Yeah.
That would have gone down.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other question? Yes, thank you.
Bishop Paul, as you just mentioned retirement, has just been asked. Recently retired, I'm interested to know what are your hopes, what are your thoughts on retirement?
So, what are your hopes and what are your thoughts as you contemplate retirement?
Well, so I can give you one or two specifics. Rosemary and I are going to live in Newark-on-Trent, so we're going back to Nottinghamshire. And that's partly pragmatic. We have eldest daughter and 2 grandchildren in Middlesbrough. The other 3 children are in London, so we'll stay on the East Coast line. We'll be on the A1, so they can come up and down. We can go up and down. And it's a nice market town. There's various other things. So my hope for the first 6, for the first 6 months, we're going to move, settle in, get to know the new community. I'm doing nothing public, no public worship, no public engagements, and I've stepped down from every trust that I'm a part of, and I've said no to every invitation to take up anything new. And I'm going to keep saying no until September. And then we'll see what emerges. That said, I think we have a deep sense that this is actually the next call on our lives. It's not the, I repeatedly say I'm retiring as the Bishop of Durham. I am not retiring from Christian ministry. I am not retiring from my passions and commitments to children and young people and refugees and so on. But how that will work out, I have no idea. And it's both scary and exciting. Because I know that under God there are things to do in the future, and it will be really interesting to see what emerges. I said I've said no to everything. There is one thing that I have said yes to, and that is that I've been asked if I will do some mentoring of bishops and clergy. There are 2 that I've said yes to already, and the current Bishop of Southern Nottingham, who's also Bishop Paul, as asked me if I would do that for some clergy in Nottinghamshire, but he and I have agreed that he's not going to give anybody to me till September or October. So mentoring, nurturing the next generation and so on will be part and parcel of it.
Yeah, question, and then please, and then to you. Yeah, thank you. What do you consider your legacy after 10 years?
Do you know, I hate the legacy word. I really, because someone asked me a couple of years ago, you know, what's your legacy? I'm not really interested in legacy. So the honest truth, I don't know. I think it's for others to decide. I was at the Civic Society on Monday night, and someone said, very kindly said that to me, that one of the legacies that Rosemary and I together will leave is that we've been a bishop and bishop's spouse who have fully engaged in the life of the community of Bishop Auckland, and that we've tried to demonstrate that that's important. There are a couple. That said. The House of Lords stuff is very interesting. There is one reality that I know is down to me and my fighting. During all the immigration stuff and different times, there was one point where I was working with an organisation called Talent Beyond Boundaries, who are amazing. They go into refugee camps and they help people with professional skills. Be able to gather the evidence, because obviously sometimes when refugees, sometimes they have to flee, sometimes they, in this instance, they particularly in Lebanon and Jordan, and many of them are Syrians, and they've been bombed out. So they didn't have any of their paperwork. They couldn't prove that they were a doctor or an engineer and so on. So what Talent Beyond Boundaries do is they go in and they help people get all the evidence that they can together to show that they're a qualified engineer or a qualified teacher and so on. And in one of the immigration, I went to the Home Office minister in the House of Lords and said, what about if this country actually developed a visa for refugees who are in camps who it's known would never be able to go back to their own country, either because they're persecuted or because their country's been destroyed, and have got the professional skills that are needed in this country? Could we not have a visa for them to be able to come? So we've got these skill gaps, we need these people, they're there. They feel their lives are wasted at the moment because they can't use them, to be fair to the government minister, they said, actually, we think you might be onto something. And they then said, actually, we don't think we need a new a visa. We think we can actually change the regulations on the work visa, on tier 2 work visas, to fulfill what you had in mind. So we kept working with them, and they worked on the regulations and give them they did it. And we had a reception one day in the House of Lords to celebrate the first 50 who had come in on that route. They were all health workers of different kinds, and they were either Syrians or Palestinians. You have to remember, you know, there are Palestinians in camps still in Lebanon and Jordan who were thrown out in 1948, and it's their children who were born in the camps and who've then had education. And the government minister, I didn't know he was going to do this, but the government minister turned round towards the end of the event, and he called me over, and he said, Paul, I need to say to the people who are gathered here, if you had not presented the idea to us and had not just persistently told us this can work, this would never have happened. And so, yeah, I now know there's over 500 people who've come in on that visa. And they're serving this country wonderfully in healthcare, in engineering, and so on. And it is a safe and legal route to use it.
Yeah, yeah. Question here, and I see a question at the back as well, please.
Yeah.
Spoken about your involvement in Bishop Auckland. I'm from the deep south of your diocese, but a non-Anglican. But I'm very, very interested with what's happening at St Cuthbert's in Durham.
Oh, yes.
I've been to Reverend James Harvey's churches, Holy Trinity and St Cuthbert's itself. I'm just thrilled to meet the other members of staff he's
Yeah.
been able to appoint. And I just wonder how you view that regeneration of this great project.
Oh, well,
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
So the question is about St Cuthbert's in Darlington, which has had a huge regeneration project. James Harvey, the vicar. Bishop Paul, what's been your experience of it, and what excites you about it?
So a few years ago, the National Church started making some money available from the church commissioners through what's called the Strategic Development Fund. And one of the ideas was what are currently called resourcing churches. And to cut the story short, we'd hoped St Cuthbert's would be one of the first ones. For various reasons, we had to decide that it wasn't right to proceed at that point. But 3 or 4 years ago, when we were able to appoint James, and he knew that we were going to explore this. So what that's enabled them to do is increase the staffing, but around particular things. So St Cuthbert's Darlington, town centre, next to the civic centre and so on. So how do we help it revivify as a civic church, as a town centre church, with a great choral tradition? And we don't want to lose that choral tradition. So part of the dream is regrowing the choral tradition, but not just the traditional church choir, but one of the people they've employed is a choir expert, and she's working with the local schools and helping them develop their choirs. And so gospel choir, other types of choir, and singing. So it's growing through music. We've also been able to put Steph Price in there as associate minister, who we keep having to remind her and the congregation that she's meant to spend most of her time not in church and not doing church services. She's meant to be out doing things. And actually, she's worked with some local people and the local MP on a chapel in a cemetery, which is now coming back into life. And so yeah, it's very exciting. It's early, and they've got a youth worker as well. And we put a curate in there who's Iranian by background. So it is very exciting, but it's a 10-year project. But we're beginning to see signs of real growth.
There's a question at the back. Yes, thank you.
Hello, Tom. Yeah. That's two questions.
Two questions for the price of one. The first of all was your role in the coronation.
Yes.
And the questioner said, Tom said, oh, there's our Paul, when you popped up on television. Tell us more about that. And then a slightly more technical question about the mineral rights underneath Weardale, which apparently are vested in the Bishop of Durham, and whether this constitutes, the discovery of lithium there constitutes good news not for you, but for your successor. Start where you want.
Okay, so of course, all those rights of the Bishop of Durham got handed to the Ecclesiastical Commission in 1844, and then on to the Church Commissioners. So not directly does it help the Bishop of Durham or the Diocese of Durham, but it does help the Church Commissioners. Many of you may well live in properties that are on land that was once held by the Bishop of Durham, and you might think you own the freehold. But look at your deeds very carefully. You probably own the freehold for the top 6 feet or maybe 5 meters. But everything lower than that, if the church commissioners have it, they still own the mineral rights. They're very canny. So in all seriousness, Tom, actually the church commissioners earn money every year from Weardale still from the stone quarrying because of the owning the underneath. So I don't know how much they get, but they do. So yes, they will get money from the lithium. It won't necessarily be a fortune, but they will have some rights to some of the income. On the coronation, occasionally people would say to me, "Oh, when the Queen dies," which of course you're not supposed to say anyway, but that you'll be involved in the coronation. And my answer always was, well, historically, yes, that's been the case, but the King, the Prince of Wales has always made it clear that he will be his own person, and when he, so I genuinely made no assumptions. So even when the Queen died, I still made no assumption about what would happen, even though rather more people started saying to me, "Are you going to be involved in the coronation?" And then the day of the coronation was announced. It wasn't very long actually after the coronation day was. And the reality is actually I did have a message very soon after that from the Archbishop of Canterbury, which was to say that the King wished the Bishop of Bath and Wells and the Bishop of Durham to know that he intended to keep with the tradition of having them as his assistants at the coronation. But that we were not to tell anybody this because there were a number of other traditions that he was not necessarily going to keep. And that obviously he didn't want some leaking out that were going to be kept because of what that might trigger. So I was allowed to tell Rosemary, but and then a little bit later, actually, Archbishop Justin said, would you please join my little planning group for around the service? So actually from early December onwards, every week from 8 to 8:30 on a Wednesday morning, I was on a Zoom call with Archbishop Justin and about 8-10 others of us, planning the service together. Not writing Justin did that with a liturgist, but ideas about how things might be done, which was including things like, how are we going to in a service which is a Church of England service, which is a Holy Communion service, how do you involve people of other faiths, which doesn't compromise their faith or compromise the Christian faith? And lots of ideas got floated around, and we ended up with what I think was actually a very clever decision to involve 5 members of the House of Lords, one who was a Muslim, one who was a Hindu, one who was Jewish, one who was Sikh, presenting something. So they weren't having to say anything, but they were visibly seen to be there, and it was made clear that they were from those faiths. And also this greeting of the faith leaders at the back of the Abbey after the service had finished, and in respect of the chief rabbi and the fact it was the Sabbath for the chief rabbi, no microphones were there so that he didn't break any of his rule. That was all done incredibly well and incredibly so I was privileged to be part of that thing. But I think that the thing that surprised, picking up your particular point, Tom, that surprised me afterwards, coming back here after that ceremony, was the number of people who said to me, strangers who said to me as well, it was so good to see you as the Bishop of Durham there. It felt like the Northeast was present.
Yeah.
So there was something, and I know, talking to Michael, who's the Bishop of Bath and Wells, he had the same from the West Country.
Yeah.
They said the West, the West,
right.
So that kind of representational role let's go right back to Wendy's question. There is something about the representational role that this particular role has, which stands out. It was an enormous privilege and honour to do it.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So, do you have you've been involved in youth work. Do you have a final message for young people involved in churches here in the region?
So
Thank you.
I recognise that it is actually really tough being a Christian in many of our schools now, when you're young, because you're a minority and so on. So I always want to begin by saying thank you for being faithful. Thank you for standing up for Jesus in your schools and your youth group, and keep doing it, and keep being brave, and God will honour that and will sustain you. So keep faithful. That's why, and keep sharing the story of Jesus with your friends in ways that don't put them off. Don't bash them over the head with the Bible too often.
Yeah, thank you.
Bishop Paul, you see the handiwork of God in many people who have no religious allegiance, ostensibly, at all. What has the institutional church to learn from that kind of witness?
So you see the handiwork of God in people who have no ostensible in terms of religious commitment. What's the church got to learn from their witness?
And so for those who don't know, that question's come from Father Dennis, who's Bishop Auckland's wonderful Roman Catholic priest. And it has truly, Dennis, it has been a privilege to know you for these last 10 years. The church needs to continually be reminded that God is bigger than the church, and that the kingdom and reign of God is much, much bigger than the church. And the church has always been called to be a witness to God and God's kingdom, not to preserve itself as an institution. But I would go back to my last thing, we keep falling back into the human frailty and weakness of thinking that we've got to preserve the institution, and that the institution is really what matters. And if I dare say it, your institution might have even more problems with this than mine, but we share them in common. One of the reasons I believe that Pope Francis and Archbishop Justin get on so well, it's an extraordinary relationship and friendship that they built, is because both of them are big enough and honest enough to admit that they're both leading institutions that have this inbuilt self-preservation. And neither of them believe that's what they stand for. So I think that's the big, and is always to be, we're always to be called to be looking out for the signs of God at work in the world where we least expect it. And that God will often, if I go back to the children thing earlier, and about how sometimes their questions or their comments show depth of insight that they don't realize they've got. And it's that openness to God might choose to speak to me through a child or through someone else. One of my favorite stories is the great story of the call of Samuel when he was a child. And Eli, I didn't call you, go back to bed. I didn't call you, go back to bed. And eventually the adult realizes, oh, hang on, God's doing something here.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
You talk about a lot on your religious life, but on your personal life, how can be a time of chickens?
Oh, our chickens, Thomas.
Yes.
We only
so
have.
The question is, we've heard a lot about your spiritual life, but tell us about the chickens.
So we only have one hen left.
Oh dear. What's going to happen?
Well,
dare one ask?
So So the really honest answer is that Rosemary and I have been desperately hoping she might die because it's all a bit inconvenient having to move a hen and a whole hen house down to a new house that we planned that there wouldn't be any hens in the garden. However, when we went down last week, we took our wooden hen house down. It's now at the back of the garden, so that if she hasn't died by the time we move into March, she's costing us everything now. She's produced 1 egg in the last 4 months, I think it is.
We've got time for probably one more question. Thank you.
I'd like to ask your reflections on probably something you've had to do, sanction the closure of churches and reorganise the ministry team so that they're more thinly spread. This can't have been a comfortable thing to do.
So the question is about when you've had to sanction the closure of churches, do a pastoral reorganisation so that clergy are more thinly spread. That can't have been an easy thing to do. What's your reflections on that?
No, it's never easy. There is a misconception. The bishop can never close a church. Archdeacons can never close a church. The diocese can never close a church. The closure of a church, I'm talking about Church of England churches here, can only be made by the decision of the local parochial church council in consultation with the local community. That then has to be endorsed by a pastoral scheme, by working with the archdeacons and the bishop and so on. Now, it would be unfair to give the impression by that answer that there aren't times where it looks very obvious to some of us outside that actually there's not much hope for and the archdeacon may well be the one who tries to help the local church council think through, might this be the way through? But it is always very painful, and the reason it's always painful is because of the nature of parish churches and the history in this country. The parish church in a village or in a community has always stood for God and for God's presence to the people of that community, regardless of whether or not they go. And the closure looks like a message to say, has the church abandoned us? Has God abandoned us? So that's why it's very painful and very difficult. But sometimes that decision has to be reached, and then you try and do it as well as you can, and that's and you have to try and think about future. One of the things you have to think is about future use. So there are very strict rules. First, you have to see if there's an alternative Christian worship use. So is there another Christian church that might take this on? That must be always the first option. And then there's other options that you can follow through if that's not feasible. And you always feel for the people involved, because very often it's because the numbers have gone very low. But sometimes those very last people, of course, have been the people who've been in that church for decades and served it for a long, long time, and they've given their all and have often really worked hard to try and turn it around. And yet clergy numbers have reduced, although although they have reduced a little bit in my 10 years in the diocese here, we've actually held the numbers at we got to a point and we said we're not going below those. Legacy. Last year, at the ordination of deacons, I ordained the highest number of deacons that this diocese has ordained in living memory. And the average age was the youngest age in living memory. So there are new people coming through. I mean, Philip was training them when he was at Cranmer Hall. There are new people coming through. And here's one of the extraordinary things for me. In the mysteries of God in the Church of England, sometimes I wonder whether the Church of England's more complex than God. But no, that's all At the very time where attendance is declining and we're struggling with finances, and post-COVID that's got harder, we've gone through a period where God seems to have called more younger, more diverse people to offer themselves for Christian ministry than we had done for a very long time. So what's going on? And part of the answer for me is the St. Cuthbert's Darlings and Holy Trinity Darlings. There are new things emerging. There are new ways of doing things emerging. I can take you to churches, St. George's Gateshead, 2016 was down to around 15, 16 regular worshippers. I'll take you there next Sunday morning. You'll see 250 people. The average age will be early 30s. Loads and loads of families. So things do change. Things can change. The problem at the moment is that the growing ones are not outdoing the shrinking ones. But I genuinely believe that we can change things around. There is now absolute commitment from the Church of England nationally to be more focused on reaching the younger generation again in a way that we've not done as fully as we could. So we are aiming at being younger and more diverse, and we're putting more energy, more money, more resource into working with children and young people. But it's not recovering Sunday schools like they were in the 1950s and 1960s. It's saying, how do young people engage in life? What are the questions? So it's looking at ecological environment. How are we helping them? How are we helping young people work on that? They love drama. They love music. So let's do choirs. Let's have drama groups and so on. Let's work through sport and with sport and so on. My son, our younger son Andrew. Sorry, I'm rambling now. Our younger son Andrew is an absolute nut for Leyton Orient. He has been since he went as a little kid. He's now a journalist, but he volunteers virtually every weekend when he can. He's doing stuff in the comms stuff for Leyton Orient. He introduced, when they played Hartlepool, when they were both in the same league, they went like that. Orient went up and Hartlepool went down, so they're not going to meet. But we went, and he said, "I'm going to introduce you. I want you to meet the captain before the game." So we went down on the pitch, and the captain came out, and he wanted us to meet the captain because the captain's a Christian. And before Leyton Orient started that football match, half the team gathered around in the middle of the field and prayed together. There are 9 Christians in the squad at Leyton Orient. Now these are 17 to 30-year-old young men, absolutely dedicated to football, but saying the most important thing in their life is serving God and they serve Jesus as footballers. So let's work through sport and so on and so on.
Thank you. That's a great positive place to end. I think I'm going to be speaking for us all in a moment when I say thank you to Bishop Paul, not only for what he shared this evening, although we've been hugely humbled and grateful by your honesty, your clarity, your obvious passion that remains undimmed from when you first.
Yeah, I'm no less, but I'm more. Do you know what? I'm more passionate now than I was when I was 16.
But we'll have a chance on Saturday, those of us at the Cathedral, to say thank you for your ministry. But I think all of us gathered here want to say thank you, not only for what you've shared tonight, but also what you shared over the last 10 years, which has been consistently humble, consistently committed not only to our local communities here in the Diocese of Durham and the region, but to national and international communities as well. You've been a friend to many of us, you've been an encouragement to us all, and a role model throughout our communities. Can we express our thanks to Bishop Paul?
Thank you.
Colleagues, it's lovely to have spent this evening with you. We now have some chance for refreshments. I think you threw in the Bishop's Also, you're welcome to enjoy, and if you want to have a word with Bishop Paul, I'm sure he'd be
Yeah.
happy to do that. Can I say thank you very much indeed for coming tonight and being part of this special evening at the Auckland Project. As Edward said earlier, do come back soon and enjoy all that's great in this place. Come to Durham Cathedral as well, and may God bless.
You're welcome at Durham Cathedral, 4:30. Well, I would come a bit before that, but the service starts at 4:30. You don't need tickets, or anything. It's open to anybody. So if you want to come on Saturday, yeah, but hopefully not the last.